Howdy, Dennis Bradford here. Let's think some about being, feeling, and doing better. It's the holiday season, which always seems a good time for me to become more aware of those with many fewer blessings than I've had in my life. I'm grateful for the monumental blessings that life has given me, especially in terms of my parents, my friends, my siblings, my relatives, and even my students. When I look at the lives of others, I always come away with the feeling that I must be the luckiest man alive. Permit me to make 3 points about the spiritual endeavor. The other day I happened upon a statement that I believe. Quote, "You can live in bliss even if you're alone, sick, failed, and broke." That's a message worth repeating to all those this month who are suffering intensely and acutely. In his excellent book, Unconditional Bliss, Kushner also advises asking ourselves and answering 2 questions. First, what is happening right now? Because we cannot dissolve dissatisfaction unless we're aware of it, unless we admit it. Second, can I be with it? Because accepting something as real, quote, allows the resistance to dissipate, end quote, and permits living in bliss, which I call and think of as opening to being. Quote from Kushner, "There is no way to change the present moment," end quote. It already is. The key to living well is to accept reality fully and expand into being. Most people create nearly all their own suffering. How? They live focusing on the future and trying to do or not do something in the present to create a better future. That's called the someday syndrome. It's not being here now. The someday syndrome doesn't work. Why? The future isn't real. At least it's not yet real. So, thinking about the imaginary future creates separation. It's nothing but living in one's thoughts. It's not living in life. It's living in your head. Except for one's thoughts, there is no future. It's only real in thoughts. So, thinking about the future creates separation from our lives that can only be lived now, here. Yes, for practical purposes, it's useful to plan for a meeting or a vacation. Plan it and forget it. Thinking is good for problem solving, but it's like the fella who only has a hammer. To him, everything else seems to be a nail. Setting goals can work for success, which is excellence in becoming with a capital B. However, and you probably know this yourself, many successful people are unhappy. Many successful people are not living well. Mastery, not success, is the key to living well. Mastery is excellence in being with a capital B. There's no such thing as an unhappy sage. In other words, someone who masters life. You can't master life and be unhappy. We get good at thinking to solve problems. It's a valuable asset that we have. We do it so frequently that we begin to believe that the purpose of life is to solve problems. Nope. The purpose of life is to live well, which requires aligning with reality rather than resisting it. Did you ever notice how much of your thinking is negative? There's not much to think about solve problems, or that for which we're grateful. we fall into frequently thinking about what is problematic or negative. And in doing so, we intentionally poison our own lives. What's the better alternative? Drop all thinking. Think only when it's necessary, and otherwise, let it go. Break the counterproductive habit of compulsive, incessant conceptualizing. Doing that immediately dissolves all attachment to beliefs and emotions, as I've argued in several books. That opens us to reality right now. And right now, the present moment, right here, is the only moment we have to live. It's the only place where we are. If it's impossible to think or conceptualize without creating separation, which is what I claim, doing so always undermines unity. In other words, thinking spawns separation, which is always the root of dissatisfaction. Notice when you're dissatisfied and ask yourself, what am I dissatisfied about? It'll be something that you think you lack. Relating this to the someday syndrome, it's impossible to live well tomorrow, today. Time separates. Therefore, emulating sages by letting go of all thoughts, and therefore also all beliefs and emotions automatically, dissolves dissatisfaction and opens becoming to being. Becoming is temporal, whereas being is non-temporal. To use a spatial analogy, being is outside time. Eternity is timeless. Tens of thousands of years of thinking have conditioned us to live in becoming. We've become quite successful at it, although we certainly spawn terrible problems. But that's another topic. Living only in becoming keeps us stuck in our thoughts. When we do that, we don't realize that we're living in conceptual prisons that we've built ourselves. That's why opening to being is required for living freely. The more we open to being, the better we live. The more freely we live, the lighter living is, the easier living becomes. We automatically do better instead of trying to force ourselves to do better by enforcing our thoughts. The more we are blissful, the more we enjoy life, the more we open ourselves to genuine love. Kushner, quote, acceptance does always lead to expansion. Expansion does provide access to bliss, end quote. His emphasis. What is accepted? Reality now, the present moment. It's impossible to accept the future because the future doesn't exist. It's important to realize that we don't have to like the present to accept it. Notice that we don't control present reality. Why? It already is. Resisting reality is insanity. And 95% of people or more are insane. What's the best way out of insanity? Accept reality. Transcend or expand beyond compulsive thinking and conceptualizing. That's the opposite of contraction. Rejection is contraction or resistance that leads to dissatisfaction, whereas acceptance is non-resistance that leads to bliss. The way to wisdom is the way of non-attachment, non-resistance, letting go. Wisdom is living well, and that's possible at every moment, regardless of one's situation, if one accepts reality. Just believing that is insufficient. It requires realizing it. Realizing it isn't easy. In fact, I've never encountered anything more difficult. Why? Well, this is why, for example, teachers in the spiritual tradition are important. In other words, traditionally, it's important to have a teacher whose level of consciousness is higher than your own. Your teacher need not be a sage, although that'd be ideal, but he or she must be significantly more open to being than you are. If you can find a teacher like that, that's the fastest and most efficient way to open to being. Gustav Bergman was one of my professors. He was an excellent mathematician as a student. He had a doctorate in mathematics, and he wrote a founding paper about lattice theory. He also confessed to me in his office one time that he said that showed both his ability in mathematics and his inability, because he didn't realize at the time what he'd done. He had a tiger by the tail and didn't know it. He was a minor member of the so-called Vienna Circle of Intellectuals in the 30s, and he emigrated to the United States with letters of recommendation from Albert Einstein and Bertrand Russell. At the University of Iowa, he was both a professor of philosophy and a professor of psychology. In fact, he founded the philosophy department there. As a psychologist, there was a requirement that he be psychoanalyzed. Well, it turned out that for him it was a useless exercise, because he was so much brighter than his analyst that he could run circles around his analyst during their sessions. It didn't do him any good. It was the little game he had to play. That's a good analogy to why your spiritual teacher's level of consciousness should be significantly higher than your own. It's also a story. It's an easy to understand story. In fact, stories are the way we understand best. There's a good rule in public speaking. Never make a point without telling a story, and never tell a story without a point. Notice that stories require time. They all have beginnings, middles, and endings. So, since time is only real in becoming, stories are always only about becoming. We cannot use our default way of understanding to understand being. That's why we have to drop thought to open to being. We cannot think our way to being. That's a grave mistake. It's an important mistake in my own life. Instead, we have to learn how to drop all thinking. That requires dropping all stories. That's why realizing or opening to being isn't easy. Only 1 in 20 people have a chance to do it, really, and less than 1 in 100 people have a chance to succeed. It doesn't have to be that way. Those are just the facts about the way it is. In other words, the spiritual endeavor of opening to being is important, it's simple, but it's not easy. That concludes today's sermon from the Gospel according to St. Bradford. I don't even claim to be a sage, and I recommend that you question everything I've just said. Still, if you think I may be able to help you live better, contact me at endfearfast.com. Peace.